Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to you joining via the Zoom online and those of you who are joining in person at Clingendael. I have the pleasure of hosting this event of Clingendael Reads, or Clingendael Reads, which is an event series that we organize on books covering international subjects for a general audience. Now, my name is Xiaoxue. I'm a research fellow at Clingendael at the Clingendael China Center for the Clingendael Netherlands Institute of International Relations. And together with my colleagues at Clingendael, we've organized these event series. Now, this edition, of course, covers the book of Joanna Chiu, who you see here behind me. Her book is named China Unbound, A New World Disorder. And we're very happy to welcome Joanna Chiu today. She's calling in from Canada, that's why she couldn't be here today. But she has years of experience covering China as a foreign correspondent. She worked both inside and outside of China. When she was in Beijing, she worked for Agence France-Presse and the Deutsche Presseagentur, excuse my pronunciation. She's also reported in Hong Kong for South China Morning Post, for The Economist, among others. And the China community might know her as well as an editor of the New Voices editorial collective, which celebrates the works of women on China. Now, today we will discuss her book, China Unbound. It covers China's expanding influence across the world, but from an on-the-ground perspective, with stories from the people that she met there. It has chapters focusing on Beijing, Hong Kong, the US, Turkey, and then I think I'm not even naming half of the chapters. It's also won the Canadian Prize, I'm going to read this out, the 2022 Writers' Trust Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing, which is the prize in Canada for the best nonfiction book on the political subject. Now, the book has recently also been published in Dutch by Lemniskaat by the name China over Grenzen, Een Nieuwe Wereldwandelorde. And it's also will be soon available in French for those who want to practice their French. Now, today's event will proceed as follows. First, we'll have an interview of Joanna Chiu with my colleague Frans-Paul from the Putten. For those of you who don't know him yet, he's the coordinator of the Clingendael China Center, a senior research fellow whose work focuses on China and the geopolitical relevance of developments around it. In 2020, also published the book De Wederopstanding van China in Dutch, which covers the rise of China since 1840, or as he says, the return of China. Then I will interview our other guest, Sjoerd and Daas, who is sitting here. Since 2019, Sjoerd is correspondent for the NOS, which is a Dutch broadcasting agency. And before that, he also worked as a journalist in China for Financiële Dagblad and RTL News. Now, after these interviews, there will be plenty of time for questions from the audience. To ask your questions online, please use the Q&A section to ask your question. For those in the room, please raise your hand and then I will come by with the microphone. Please also speak into the microphone because we will be recording and sharing this event later online. And so that your question is really, that our Joanna Chiu is able to hear your question. Well, first, please give a warm welcome to Frans-Paul and Joanna.
Thank you, Xiaoxue, and welcome to you all, and welcome especially Joanna. Joanna, can you hear me? Can you see me? Okay, great. I think you can also. Can we hear you? Let's...
Yes. Can you
yes.
hear me now?
We can hear you. I guess you can also you see not just me but also yourself because you are on the big screen behind me. And so what I see, there's another screen in front of me where I see you, and also in front of me there is the audience because we have an audience here. So the unfortunate thing about the technical situation that we have is that it's not easy for you to see the audience, but you just have to imagine that's a group of people here at Clingendael who are really very interested. So for the people, so those who are here because they read the book. Very good, because now we're going to have a conversation about the book, a little bit about the background of the book. And for those of you who have not yet read the book, buy the book, read it. It's very good. You can choose the English version or the Dutch version. Both are excellent. So Joanna, we have about 20 minutes now to have a conversation about you, your work, and the book. And let me start by inviting you to take some time to explain to the audience, especially for the people who are not yet familiar with the book, what is your purpose of the book? So what motivated you to write this book? Like Xiaoxue said, it's a book that covers a lot of subtopics. It's a very broad book, but at the same time, I think it also addresses some very core fundamental questions and issues. So what brought you to this? And also maybe as part of your explanation about the book, can you say something about the subtitle? Because the subtitle is A New World Disorder. So I'm also very interested to hear why did you choose the word disorder for the subtitle?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, all of you, for joining in person and on Zoom. I wish I could be in the Netherlands right now with all of you, but it's very overwhelming that you all took the time to join me today, and my fellow panelists as well. So very excited for this conversation. And thank you, Lemmiskat and the Clingendael Institute for hosting this, and obviously my publisher for publishing the Dutch edition of the book. So my goal was to write an engaging book that anyone in the world could use to critically evaluate any China-related issues in the news. I think even among China experts, sinologists, politicians, myself included, there's a tendency to want to try to compartmentalize what is happening in Asia as far away, including human rights crackdowns, including things like the internment of Uyghurs. So when I returned to Canada after 7 years of working as a journalist in China, I thought the China chapter of my life was over. To be honest, I was pretty burnt out from often covering really heavy political issues, from interviewing the wives of human rights lawyers who had disappeared, from interviewing feminists who were jailed for really simple actions. So I was settling into my job at the Toronto Star newspaper in Vancouver when not even a month passed. Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei CFO, was arrested in Vancouver International Airport, sparking in my own city this huge international crisis. Soon after, the two Michaels, one Michael, a former diplomat on leave, and another, a business person, was arrested very clearly as hostages by China in response to try to put pressure on Canada and the US, and in extension, Western allies to comply to release Ms. Meng. So I realized with a heavy heart, because one of the Michaels is a personal friend of mine, that the China story was very global. It affects people around the world, foreign citizens, immigrants. So I wanted to help tell that story of a global China, to provide that necessary context across country comparisons, as well as, like Xiaoxue said, spotlight those important individual stories that will help us ground public debate on a very human level. I also wanted to address the kind of shrinking opportunities to study China, to study Mandarin and Cantonese and other languages, even as public interest in China is spiking. In many of the places I traveled to, including in Europe, even though there's so many different, media stories about China, very few opportunities for the interested public to actually study China, to take a university course, to take a language course. So, I wanted the book to kind of be almost like a self-study, a starting point, and also in and of itself, a rich source of information to help people kind of figure out where they fit, where their countries fit, individually, what they can do. For questions like, should people in democracies be worried about China's rise? I wanted to treat those stories with nuance and the proper context, including historical context, because the risk of oversimplifying and stoking racism and xenophobia in these times of heightened tensions is very real. That's why, along with my work at New Voices that spotlights women China experts, many of my sources are people who are ethnically Chinese, who at least have lived in China, so they have that real rich lived experiences. Bringing readers right to the scenes of major diplomatic events like street protests in Hong Kong, meeting with me exiled Uyghur communities in Istanbul, and the struggles of those affected by the ongoing the US-China trade conflicts. So, I've really been happy about the response to the book and the kind of conversations I've had with readers, because everyone, I think, is, thinking deeply about these issues, like what can we do? And as for the subtitle, the word disorder is actually not just kind of putting the blame on China. In my travels to different half a dozen Western countries, every continent basically, I found that a lot of kind of decades of ignorance or misinterpretation about China in these Western countries have led to this state of disorder we see today. There's disinformation about China, not just coming from, Beijing state media sources, but coming from American, coming from Italian, coming from European media about China. Things that prominent public figures say around the world that are often just not true or they're harmful, and this contributes to this state of disorder.
But I think that's a very interesting point that you also make in the book, and in particular the role or the responsibility also of the Western world, of the Western governments, and maybe also business and other parts of society. So you point at the problems that relate to China in terms of human rights, the human rights abuses in China itself, and China's interference in other countries. And then you write that it's also Western governments or Western countries that bear some of the responsibility for China having become the player that it is now, of the entity, the identity that it currently has.
Yes. So why I mentioned the two Michaels, before that, dozens of Canadians of Asian descent were also political prisoners in China, but they didn't rise to this level of international awareness. So I think there is a lot of internalized discrimination there. China's efforts to influence foreign communities in the 90s, 80s, the research in my book showed that it focused on immigrant communities around the world. But these immigrant communities were foreign citizens. They were citizens in democracies, and they were trying to warn about what was happening, starting in more, Chinese language, Chinese immigrant communities. But in every place I went to, a lot of these warnings, a lot of this intelligence and information, it was widely ignored. And by the public, by governments, I looked up parliamentary, appeals, and, I had to dig for them. They really weren't listened to decades ago. So I feel like the West is kind of catching up to, there's foreign interference going on. There's something called the United Front department in China that's focused on things like building influence around the world. So I feel like this playing catch up is something that we do need to acknowledge, because to, now craft smart policy in China, you kind of need to acknowledge that widely, we haven't been paying as much attention as we should have in recent decades.
Was it then previously out of the self-interest of the West not to pay too much attention to these things because they were already there, the signs were already there, as you point out? Was it because the West had an interest in not paying attention, and why is this changing now? Is this interest not there anymore?
I think the interest is there, but what has changed in recent years as China has turned to more aggressive, hostage-taking diplomacy, or using those kind of trade war tactics to pursue its goals around the world, is that this myth that we had in the past, where you could maybe raise human rights on one hand, but then really enthusiastically pursue trade deals and economic ties on the one hand. That kind of idea came crashing down, that there are these parallel tracks, because as tensions rose politically, businesses saw the hits. Farmers in different countries, got tariffs blocking the sale of their crops into China. Winemakers, students. So I think people realize that in order for economic ties to also be positive, they have to address these political dimensions of both the relationship and also China's internal political and human rights situation. There was kind of an idea that, okay, we mostly focus our governmental resources on pursuing the economic, and then human rights policy is something on the side. But with, say, taking the two Canadians hostage, China threatening the mayor of Prague for speaking up about, its policies on Taiwan, blocking the Prague Orchestra from traveling in China. All of these things, I think people in the West have realized that the repercussions of China's political system affects not only Chinese people and immigrants, Chinese immigrants around the world, but it affects their societies so broadly. Things like the Hong Kong national security law, it actually applies to any person in the world. Hong Kong police have issued arrest warrants for an American citizen living in Los Angeles for his role in supporting the democracy movement there. So suddenly it feels like there's this international element to China's oppression, but the signs have been there for a long time. People around the world tell me that, the signs were there, but people still kind of had this kind of wishful thinking that maybe, in Germany, there's a phrase, I don't know the original German, but, they can pursue change through trade. So you can somehow change a country's political system through trading with them, through those economic ties. And actually, I've lived in Beijing. I've spoken with people, European business based in China. They don't believe it, but because they've had the firsthand experience of what it's like to try to operate their business in China. So things like what Bill Clinton said, what other major Western leaders saying that just some more interactions will just naturally push China into a more liberal direction. In fact, I argue in the book that the opposite has become true. As China became richer, it became more confident in its authoritarianism, that it could pursue this kind of modified form of capitalism with Chinese characteristics. And, and has also treated foreign companies on Chinese soil with more and more prejudice and more obstacles, rather than this free market, that would an even playing field that was promised. So as there's been more and more trade tensions, as foreigners, and I would say, frankly, white people have been taken as political prisoners, or foreign Western journalists have been kicked out, had their visas revoked. Right now there's, Sjoerd can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no Australian journalists in China anymore because of backlash against the Australian government's kind of pushback on China's policies. So all of this lashing out is happening, and people are asking why, but this kind of wishful thinking for decades of not preparing for this point, I argue is an explanation that has to be addressed before we try to figure out what to do going forward.
I have one last question I wanted to ask you before we move on to the audience and allow them also to ask questions. So I think your book is should be read as a warning, as it shows how this whole process is developing. So the rise of China is having this effect, something to be aware of. And I think many examples, but I guess from the Dutch point of view, from the Dutch perspective, the experience of Canada is particularly relevant, because it's something that I think the Netherlands is a country that the Netherlands can relate to, and also what happened to the two Michaels. But given all this, how do you see the prospect for coexistence, to exist jointly, between the West and China in a single global, in single global system? Is that possible, and what would it take for that to be possible?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'd love to hear what panelists and audience members think of this, because it is the biggest question of the day when it comes to China-Western relations. That's why my book, people ask me why I didn't go to India or to Southeast Asia, where China has a big influence and where it tries to assert influence on different economies and democracies and governments. But I went to Western countries because I feel that we don't have to just look at the superpower showdown, US versus China, but spotlighting the experiences of different middle power countries, like the Netherlands, like Canada, like Australia, and across Europe, places I spotlighted and discussed in the book, is important, because largely how this dynamic will play out really depends on what middle power countries do. At least in Canada, the idea a lot of politicians had was we are too small to make a difference when it comes to China's political issues or human rights issues, really. So we could leave that to America to handle. But we've seen with the Trump administration leading some of the critiques of Beijing, and how without that kind of multi-country pushback and contributions, it can be quite affected by whatever politics of the day dominates the US government. And in the US, we saw a lot of misinformation come from Trump and other sources. I argue that this misinformation on China has continued under, because it's become so popular in the US, Washington DC to be as hawkish on China as possible. So I think it is healthy for other countries to get involved in these discussions to engage with the China kind of questions. And even the idea of engagement versus containing China, I think, has been so simplistic in the past. That dichotomy of you can have a choice to contain China, contain China's power and influence, I think it's just impossible. So there's only engagement, there's only dealing with China as a major country, as a country of 1.4 billion in the world. I think there's no choice there. So the debate versus engaging versus trying to restrict China's power is kind of a distracting conversation. I would say that it's ironic that both sides, different sides' efforts to change the other, to control the narratives of themselves in the world, has actually led to the shutting down of the sort of people-to-people exchanges that are probably the best and most productive and nuanced ways to change the other. With the US and China trade war spiking and with COVID, but I think COVID was a convenient excuse of the US shut down the Fulbright program. It revoked the visas of many Chinese national scientists and students, kicked out Chinese journalists. So I think actions like this actually removes the ability for that kind of ground level coexistence and peaceful mutual understanding to happen, because what we have left is the mouthpieces of the state, trying to engage with each other. And I think that's not very healthy, as foreign media are kicked out and we're left to try to understand China from afar. This is the kind of dynamic that's happening as these tensions have risen. And I think it's tempting for people in the West to try to retaliate. China is, bullying, harassing our journalists, so we are going to kick out Chinese journalists, or we are going to treat all Chinese students and scientists as spies, or prosecute them as potential spies in a very clumsy manner. So I see this happening, and it is really a direction that I think might not be the best direction, because we don't need less information and access to China. We need as much information as possible. We need to talk to the people who are of Chinese backgrounds. Instead, in my research, I've shown that people with even, parents or grandparents who were born in China, they're actually facing systemic discrimination. They don't get security clearance when they apply for jobs in government or, defense departments in the West. They get asked, where does your loyalty lie? Is it to China or with us? Whereas these group of people, many people I interview in the book, they actually can provide us with some of the most insightful information and research on China, rather than pushing them out because of this atmosphere of antagonism with China.
Okay, thank you. Yes, well, I think this also relates to the very important warning that you mentioned at the very end of the book, that this image of the yellow peril is something that is very undesirable, and that should not be that should not become bigger. And the importance of making the distinction between the Chinese government and the Chinese people. Now, before we move on, there's one thing I would like to say that relates to what I said before about buying the book. I said it in a wrong way. If you're not a Dutch, if you cannot read Dutch, buy the English book. But if you can read Dutch, buy the Dutch translation, which is just new, which is a very good translation. So I thought I should just say that, because the idea to have this meeting today was because of the recent publication of the Dutch translation. So I should put a bit more emphasis on that. I'm looking at Xiaoxue now. Do you have time for one question?
I can take one question from the audience that is physically in the room, but for those that are joining online, don't worry, there's plenty of time at the end for questions as well. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I'll come to you with the microphone.
Oh yeah, and could you please, even though Joanna can probably not see you on camera, but could you still say your name and your affiliation?
Yes, my name is Casper Wits from Leiden University. I'm a China specialist and lecturer there. First of all, thank you very much for joining us and for your book, which I have read 80%. Not completely yet, but in any case, I've faced a problem in the classroom with Chinese and Hong Kong students feeling intimidated and therefore reluctant to speak out. And I was basically interested in hearing your views on how we can deal with this situation and create a safer environment for Chinese students. I mean, not just those who are critical of China, but also those who are not. I mean, just in general, and maybe specifically also the role of the Chinese Students and Scholars Association. Whether, for example, we should, as a university, make clear that we do not approve of their sort of intimidation tactics and so on. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I can actually see you, so technology here. I see different angles. I feel like I'm hovering around the room. But yeah, it's a great question. And like while I was writing the book, you know, I started before the pandemic. Luckily, a lot of my undergrad reporting was in 2019. But as I was writing, it was, you know, COVID, the pandemic was spreading. And along with the disease, there was this terrible spread of anti-Asian hate and harassment and attacks. So living in Vancouver, I was actually in one of these like epicenters of Asian hate. Elderly people were just attacked by and, you know, blamed for the pandemic. People saying, go back to China, like little girls were punched in the face. I was worried about my parents. I was worried about myself. So it was this, I think a lot of China experts, journalists have this kind of internal tension and worries and dilemmas in our minds when we're trying to raise awareness about Beijing's human rights crackdowns and foreign intimidation and interference tactics, because it does sound very aggressive and scary and makes people angry. Our reports, like my research, I know that it sparks a reaction, often an angry reaction. But unfortunately, sometimes this anger, these emotions are misdirected to regular Chinese people. And for some, it's against people who are not political at all, or they're actually critical of Beijing as well. They're getting the heat. It's interesting, one of my case studies in Australia, when these foreign interference laws that the government was tabling were first proposed, most Australians of Chinese background supported them. They supported the idea that Australia should strengthen its national security and to learn more about, you know, things like espionage and political donations. But as all of these attacks also increase, all of this hate increase in Australia, a survey by the Lowy Institute found a lot of people of Asian descent felt that these laws and like the ensuing kind of anger about China's political system and influence in Australia was a direct cause of hate crimes against them. So it's a strange dynamic where as I do this research, you worry that no matter how careful you try to be, it can lead to more hate because these, roots of, racism, xenophobia run deep and just need some trigger, and then it can get worse. So I've spoken to classrooms where there are people, international students from China, and people from Hong Kong, Taiwan, who do seem uncomfortable or who are quiet. And other times, I think when teachers provide that space where they feel more understood and feel safer to speak, some of these difficult conversations can come up in the classroom. So one of these classrooms I visited, a student who lives in a province close to Xinjiang was trying to argue against, evidence of the internments of Uyghurs. But you can see that even as he was parroting Chinese state media lies about what was happening, his face was just so emotional. He started crying. So I think he knew that a lot of what was happening was true. And this is a very difficult experiences that students experience and go through. And I think giving that space to discuss and not just shooting down what they're saying as wrong right away can help with that. When the app Clubhouse, the audio-only chat rooms, was first launched, Chinese people were in these rooms, and they were talking about these major issues like Hong Kong, crackdowns, Uyghurs, and there was that space for people around the world speaking in Mandarin to them to help them sort through those emotions of figuring out what was happening. And a lot of people said, they realized what was happening. They're very heartbroken that their government could do something like this. So having these spaces for discussions, I think, is so important. I think it is so helpful when people around the world try to learn Mandarin to try to engage with people from Chinese descent in their own, comfortable language. That makes a big difference. And one of the things I just try to repeat is that language still matters. For academics or researchers, writers like ourselves, we can do a little bit of helping people make the differences and distinctions by, in our headlines saying Chinese government or Beijing or CCP, rather than saying China is doing this, China is attacking so-and-so, China is spying. That also helps. I would love to have your ideas on that. I wish I could be in the room so we could chat about, how best to make people feel safer, because it's hard. Even when you do your best, fellow students do their best. There are issues of Chinese embassies and spying and tracking international students around the world. So even if the professor does everything in his or her power, people could still be very rightfully worried. As far as the associations, some associations have been linked to working with embassies. Here in Canada, there's some WeChat screenshots proving this, but not all. So personally, I don't think shutting all of the Chinese student associations down would be fair. But I think one of the things that could help is having anonymous kind of tips, like anonymous people trying to report to university authorities about what they're seeing and hearing, so there could be, and for them to be heard. A lot of times when people have, faced like kind of strange pressures, they try to report to their schools or the police, and there's not the understanding or infrastructure in these institutions to know what to do with these reports. Most times the cases I talk about in the book, these people who are trying to report what's happening, like spying, intimidation from Chinese embassies and agents, their reports don't even get filed. They don't reach, more senior levels and administrators and leaders.
Joanna, thank you for the conversation. We now move on to the next part, and I will switch places with Sjoerd.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. There will be. I already saw a few questions for you to come back at the end when we have the Q&A. But first, we'll welcome Sjoerd and Daas to the stage. I think he is quite well known to many of you as having appeared on the Dutch national news a lot of times, working for the NOS since 2019, as I mentioned. But I think it will be interesting to hear why you decided to become a foreign correspondent in China in the first place.
Oh, it was the last thing that I really wanted when I became a journalist. I'm actually a schooled physical therapist. That's where I started, basically. That was my hobby. I got injured quite a bit when I was doing track and field back when I was young. So I really knew it. I was going to become a physical therapist, but already curious about China. So I was studying a little bit of Chinese with the idea like maybe I go for acupuncture, maybe I'll go for something else in traditional Chinese medicine. And at some point I was like, this is probably not my future. If I want to go to China, I probably got to do something else. So I actually went for a study in finance with then the idea to go there with a multinational, maybe join a Chinese company. But then I took another turn towards RTLZ, a business channel for people who are from the Netherlands. They probably know it. It still exists. My mother is still watching, and a few others. But then I was a journalist, and I was like, okay, I've been studying Chinese next to my physical therapy. I've spent a year in China. Studying Chinese in Beijing. I've traveled there extensively in the region, did an internship there as well in Shanxi, the countryside of which back then one of my colleagues was like, if you like it in Shanxi, in Linfen, back then one of the most polluted places in China, AQI 500 plus, this was back in 2007, and 500 plus is actually also the max of what back then could be measured with these consumer devices. My colleague was like, if you like it in Shanxi and Linfen, you probably really like it here in China. So you'd be able to live wherever in the country if you like this shithole, with all due respect, because Linfen is a beautiful place. It is an amazing city. With beautiful villages and very rich history as well, by the way. But if you like it there, you love it everywhere. So when I eventually was with RTLZ, I was like, probably I should go for a career in journalism in China, but it definitely was not my first choice, no.
So that was a good test case to see if you would like your work in China.
I mean, it's I think particularly with becoming a China correspondent, coming from journalism with very little China experience, if you have already discovered a bit of the country, if you have spent time to actually study Chinese, to try to understand more about the history, the culture, different regions in the country, that is not a bad start for a China correspondent, but you will find amongst the correspondents a very diverse group of people, obviously.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, and you've been reporting on China for quite a few years, and in those years, our perception of China has also really changed, become a lot more negative. Did you notice any changes in your work when you were there, working as a journalist?
I have noticed these. Joanna writes about 2008 as one of the moments. That was obviously one of the moments where China and Beijing in particular wanted to present itself to the world as a place that is open, a place that is progressing. China was back, so to say. There was also the time when journalists, for the very first time, were actually able to travel throughout the country. I mean, before that, you needed permission from the Waiban, from the Foreign Affairs Office of the provincial capital or the local departments. After that, that was all gone. There was also the time, and Joanna referred to that earlier as well, when a lot of people around the world were like, well, once they get richer, they'll become a little bit more liberal. Maybe not like us, they will move into that direction because the Chinese people will at some point also demand that. They want to get rich, they want to have a nice house and a car, and at some point they maybe want democracy. Well, of course, everybody knew how that went. And right now, I mean, we're 2022, we've had the Beijing Winter Olympics, the lockdown Olympics, so you want. It was a time where China again wanted to present itself, obviously, wanted to put up a show for the world. But it was obviously in a time when the country was under lockdown. Sure, within China, there was not a lot of cases at that point in time, Delta, they were still able to manage it pretty well with some lockdowns. I mean, Xi'an was, I think, the latest before the Olympics started. But it was obviously a country that had been behind a wall for already 2 years. And I do think that is maybe not the greatest metaphor maybe to use, but we are obviously running increasingly against that wall. That has been a development already for quite a couple of years. But particularly during COVID, that has exacerbated quite a bit. But before already, I mean, you don't need permission from anyone to do interviews. I mean, sure, you should not go maybe to a military airport and shoot footage there. Not a great idea. But everything else, the rules are pretty clear. There is freedom of press. If someone grants you an interview, if someone wants to talk to you, you're allowed to shoot that. You're allowed to ask whatever question possible. But what you already saw is that many companies, many individuals, local villages, everybody got a little bit more hesitant already. Sure, it was still possible to talk to people, human rights activists. It was possible to find whoever, but what you would run into in practice is that a lot of people, once you arrived, I mean, shortly before COVID, I think it was an acrobatic school near Zhengzhou in Henan, in the one of the most populous places in China, so to say, but an acrobatic school run by an acrobat, training kids to become acrobats or do something else. But we had all the permissions, and when we got there, he said, like, well, I actually got a phone call. Not a great idea, because it might look bad for me and for the country, for the party, that actually this is not a government initiative. The party cannot take care of its young acrobats. It's me who initiated this. Yeah, it's amazing, but it might show that the government is not able to provide. So even those kinds of stories became difficult, and oftentimes they start to refer again to Waiban, the provincial level, to make sure that at least they are not the ones who grant you permission, that they are not the ones who make mistakes, but that the responsibility eventually is with the government or with the propaganda department. And those guys typically are like, well, no, you're able to do whatever you want, because also they don't want to take responsibility. So it's become a little challenging, to say the least, the last couple of years, apart from obviously all the travel restrictions that we've run into over the last couple of months.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot more sensitivities on reporting in China right now.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be pretty clear if you go to Xinjiang that potentially might be sensitive. That used to be the case with Tibet, obviously, as well, where we can only go with government permission on government organized trips. At some point, I think it was 2015, stock market crash, the economy got a little bit more sensitive as well. And it feels like right now that even what could be considered good propaganda, positive stories, which is what Xi Jinping wants us to tell as well, that even that is going to become much more difficult, because for many individuals, it's like, okay, what is there to gain and what is there to lose? And oftentimes there's relatively little to gain, and potentially chance might not be extremely high with a positive story, but there's always this chance that you lose a lot. So even like the companies that 2015, 16 were going out to conquer the world, were really open. Also, these companies are now back and mainly thinking about, okay, what would Beijing think? What would our party chief here think? What is the potential risk? And it makes it obviously much more difficult to tell stories and to shape a comprehensive picture of the country.
Yeah, that ties into my next question as well. We've seen that perceptions here of China have been changing a lot, but how have perceptions in China been changing, and their perception of us, the West, if you could say that, Europe, the US? Are people still willing to share this opinion as openly as they were before? Because there's a lot of nationalism on the rise now, especially on the Chinese internet. Mm-hmm. And you see that opinions that don't really align with that view are either sidelined or pushed away in favor of this really nationalist sentiment.
Yeah, for some reason, these nationalists also always get higher up onto Weibo, and the rest you don't really see. Now, what it is, I think, particularly in the last 2.5 years since COVID, I mean, before that, people would go out. Sure, there's not a lot, relatively speaking, Chinese people with a passport. It's less than 100 million. I don't remember the exact figure. But right now, you also see that people cannot apply for new passports. If they expire, they can't renew them. Some people with existing passports have run into difficulties, which obviously makes it a whole lot more difficult to actually see what's going on outside of the Great Firewall, so to say. There's also less people obviously coming into China at the moment due to all the restrictions. So there's just less encounters between Chinese people and the rest of the world. I think in the very first beginning of COVID, I mean, everybody was shocked to some extent by Wuhan and what happened there. But the idea I got from friends, people I talked to in the country, because back then we were able to travel still quite a bit. Okay, it is quite extreme, but this is probably necessary. If the government does this right now, it might be a little much, but better safe than sorry. So for a lot of people, there was actually quite a bit of understanding, and particularly also what fed into the state narrative is when Europe and the US saw huge numbers and also a lot of people who died from COVID. So that basically confirmed their idea that what China was doing was actually quite okay, and what the West was doing was just messing things up, which to some extent I can follow, by the way, as well. What happens now is that people actually see they're still stuck in their lockdown. In Shanghai, people are allowed to breathe a little bit more air these days, fortunately, but some of them were stuck for 60 days, some of them for 80 days or longer. Some of them are stuck again because the lockdown for many of the Xiaoxues, the compounds, continues. But these people now look, if they have access, and in Shanghai, Beijing, there is obviously more people, relatively speaking, with access to also other sources than the state media and the more nationalistic Guanxia or Global Times, etc. That these people see like, hey, but actually, yeah, sure, in the West, there is still people dying, but with high vaccination ratios, it's actually quite manageable. What is happening in our country? Relatively speaking, though, apart from the big cities, I think for a lot of people, they don't really have a clue what's going on. If you're living on the countryside in a village and you're mainly watching Xinjiang the evening news, those people don't necessarily have a very comprehensive view on what's happening outside of the country. And it obviously also has been further limited by the more nationalistic tone in particularly state media like Guanxia, for instance, who basically have been attacking a lot of my colleagues over the last 2 years, particularly. These people think that we're all there essentially to smear, to defame China, and to just, to quote those articles, to just hurt the feelings of the Chinese people. That obviously makes it very difficult to still have them to speak up.
Yeah, and on your point of news coverage on China hurting the feelings of the Chinese people, I do have to mention your coverage of the 2022 Beijing Olympics. There was an incident there. We'll touch upon it, but you were doing a live broadcast for the Dutch national news. And during that live broadcast, you were forced to stop the broadcasting. You were being pulled away from the camera by somebody who was undercover or as a plainclothes officer, as a security guard. And you were able to rejoin the broadcast later on. But the incident really went viral online. There was a lot of attention to you being pulled away as a journalist during your reporting. I cited a tweet about it. I think it has more than 2,500 likes and a lot of retweets and comments underneath it. Yeah. International media picked it up to make a statement about doing journalism in China. And meanwhile, on the Chinese social media, you could see a lot of comments saying, well, he's just doing it for attention.
Yeah.
He's just doing it to stand out. He's doing it on purpose. He was in a restricted area, filming there when he wasn't supposed to be there. So of course, this reaction was logical of the security guard. Could you tell us your story about what happened, and if this says anything about
So last time I'm going to talk about this. No, no. So I mean, what always happens during these kinds of events, you're going to spot beforehand, hey, what could be a good place to do your lives. So that's what we did the day before there as well. What the police always does, and particularly during these major events, they announce more or less what the off-limit areas would be. So we knew that. We had a spot. Ideally, we would have stood on a bridge, but that's difficult, particularly if Putin is coming down on the fourth ring as well. So we found a spot that was open until 7, and the police was there as well. And they were like, guys, you know that this is going to close at 7, right? I was like, yeah, but is it okay to be here at least until like 6:45? I'm like, totally fine. Everybody seemed to be very well instructed, extremely friendly. And we did our lives there at first, and then 6:45, they were like, guys, it's time to leave. Towards a place that was then outside of the cordoned area. I actually stepped on what probably by now is grass, to just make sure, because this is often a problem, that police would tell you that, hey, there's actually pedestrians that's supposed to be walking here. You're blocking the crowds. So we're like, okay, we're going to stand here on the grass then, so make sure that we don't get any any hassle with that. And a few minutes later, we were live, and I was about to speak out my first few words when suddenly a guy was walking away with our light installation. So for me, that was quite laughable in a way, because like, what is happening here? How am I going to solve this? This obviously all happened in a split second. And then another guy pulled me away. There was no explanation at first. And they told us that we were not allowed to be there. I mean, we were at the corner of the street, so to say, and that should be at the corner on the right side of the fence. According to them, even outside of the fence, you were not allowed to stand. So yeah, eventually that led to a lot of attention, unfortunately, because this happens a lot to us. If we do a piece to camera, a stand-up, if we interview people in public areas, there is certain areas that are off limits, but you never know which areas are off limits. Sometimes a normal street can be off limits because that's a grading, that's the regulation. But no one ever knows what kind of regulation it's actually, what actually limits us from shooting there. But oftentimes it's obviously not live. Here it was live, so there was very little we could do to save our face / the face of the volunteer there. So yeah, we had some. Next morning I woke up and I don't think I've ever had more emails, WhatsApp messages from all over the world, tweets, etc., etc. So I tried to explain a little bit of what happened, what I just told you. And I do remember that my press card renewal was coming up very soon after visa renewal. In my case, I'm very fortunate. We still get 12 months. That's not necessarily the case for all journalists. Some are on a 1-month visa. Some are on a 3-month visa, which is people working for American outlets or American citizens working for other media. So still going for my 12 months. I did eventually get that as well, but they did want to clarify that they were not very much amused by it, and that they also shared the kind suggestion that I should maybe clarify that it was all my mistake and that it was not a thing. And I've answered them that I've heard them, but that I think I've said enough, and that I would not want to add any more oil to the fire. Yeah.
Very diplomatic response. I think looking at the time, we can open the floor to questions, both from the online audience and from the physical room. I think I'll first take a question from the online audience, and then I'll walk around with the microphone. So raise your hand when you have a question. Questions can be asked to both Sjoerd, Joanna, and Frans-Paul as well. Let's see. We have a question about for Joanna about her point to make a distinction between the Chinese government and Chinese individuals, meaning students, researchers, etc. She asks, do you have some specific tips and tricks, useful tools or platforms to make this distinction between the Chinese government on the one hand and individuals on the other hand? How can one make sure that an individual doesn't have any bad intentions, and which steps can be taken to check this as much as possible?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is very complicated because you can't tell from looking at someone or even doing a really cursory, simplistic kind of, inquiry into someone's actions, because people are complicated. Sometimes people are patriotic and loyal to the Chinese government, and they do that of their own volition. They're not agents of the state. They're merely nationalistic or patriotic, like many of us are about our countries. And often that makes it difficult to distinguish when people are acting of their own accord or they have ties to Chinese government. And that's the kind of, you can't do much in democracies if someone's expressing or acting or protesting because they support another government. But you can, governments do have ways to address when an individual or an organization has actual ties to the Chinese government, or they're actually tasked with maybe economic espionage or spying, or they're trying to intimidate or suppress the free speech of people like in the Netherlands, in Canada, in Europe. This has happened where, like I found in my research and others have found in their research, that embassies, the United Front have been in touch with people in different countries and appointed them or work with them to try to pursue different aims, like supporting certain politicians who they think might be more pro-Beijing in the elections, providing political donations, having these kind of meetings with senior levels of government, or showing up at the doorsteps. I found in a small suburb in Canada, over a dozen people, because they took part in solidarity marches for Hong Kong, that they actually received physical visits from Chinese officials, people from the embassy. And when they tried to report it, police didn't pay attention to them. I only learned about this because the mayor of this small town was actually interested. So he, police not doing much, he decided to tell me that this was happening. So this has happened all over the world, and it's difficult because it's hard to parse different people's intentions. But since the book was published and I had more conversations with different governments, I traveled to UK and other places. There are kind of efforts right now from governments to have these conversations, including with diaspora communities, people of Chinese descent who have had longer experience because they've been dealing with this since 80s, 90s. And that's a good way to start to try to understand the roots of these activities, things like astroturfing. I spoke with someone in Canada. He had a group that was helping refugees from Tiananmen Square, the massacre. And they had a name. And then a couple of years later, as they were becoming more prominent, suddenly there was another group that had a very, very similar name to them in both English and Chinese. Like the acronym was almost identical. And they started taking these interviews and kind of try to sow chaos, trying to say the opposite of whatever this original group was saying. So that's an example of astroturfing. That's an example, a tactic of trying to make the public confused with these groups that seem grassroots and organic, but actually later you find out that they do have ties to embassy or Chinese government. And these things are hard to prove, but I think a lot of times media or people aren't looking for these stories. When I moved back to Canada, and it just happened that another colleague of mine also had experience in China and spoke Chinese, and we just started being open to these stories, and they're everywhere. We had a lot of exclusive pieces, including this fake Tibetan association based out of New York that was trying to pretend that they are, they forged the letters from the Prime Minister of Canada and major politicians saying that actually, they support the government's actions in Tibet and things like that. So these things are happening in plain sight. Often I find that associations aren't shy about bragging about what they're doing. They just write it in Chinese. Literally, there's a lot of groups that have an English version on their website and a Chinese version. All you have to do is go into Chinese version and you see things like their charter, how many trips they take to Beijing. They work with the liaison office in Beijing. So a lot of these things, we feel that it might be so hard to understand, but it's actually there. It's just a problem of lack of resources, lack of Chinese language research. I spoke with some police departments who were, tasked with figuring out some of this out, and they admitted to me that language was a barrier. They didn't catch things like death threats against Chinese Canadians because they didn't have someone in the police station who could read Chinese. They actually told me that it was helpful for me when I did a story that had subtitles of some of these videos, because then they were able to figure out what footage to look at. So to me, a lot of it is resources. It's not impossible to try to investigate and figure out people's intentions. And also, it's great to see you, Sjoerd. It's my funny way to reunite with a friend.
Yeah.
I'll open the floor to some questions from the audience here as well. Please also introduce yourself so Jenna knows who she's talking to.
I will. Thank you very much. My name is Fred Sengers. I'm an independent publicist and researcher on modern China. First of all, I would like to thank Joanna and the panelists for the presentation here. And my question for Joanna, but perhaps Frans-Paul wants to mention a few words about it as well, is Joanna mentioned in a presentation that a containment of China is not an option, so we need to engage. And I would like to ask, what would be effective ways to engage with China to serve our interests, or do we have to accept that we have no influence whatsoever?
Yeah, I'd love to also hear what Sjoerd thinks about that, because in the last few years, he's been living in China and as a foreign journalist. And, he and I and many other foreign journalists, every time we go to these foreign ministry briefings in China, we ask questions, and a lot of the responses, this is meddling, foreign countries are trying to meddle in our internal affairs. Often I haven't myself been part of these kind of arguments between the foreign ministry spokespeople and journalists. There's a lot of emotion there. And I think that that reflects that people in China, the government does care about what the foreign community, what governments think. There's almost a hypersensitivity to what others think about what China is doing. And speaking with, starting back when I started reporting on these issues in 2012, and even increasingly more recently, people who have been the subject of arrest, intimidation, people who are part of civil society, like lawyers, professors, writers, tell me that when governments make statements, when different government embassies look into their cases, they see improvement in their treatment, even under arrest, even in prison. They notice when they become more prominent that it leads to a little bit of better treatment for them. So I wouldn't say that China doesn't care. Sometimes the kind of talking points, basically they're saying like, you have no right, or we don't care what you think. When it comes to what's happening in Xinjiang, that's an example of where there was a delay. The United Nations didn't say anything as a group until 2 years after the first reports of the camps were in place. Interview, one of the diplomats said that no country wanted to be seen as a ringleader in leading the UN to make a statement against what was happening in Xinjiang. And after there was a lot of international attention, the Chinese government eventually said, the camps are being shut down. They're going to be, the basic prisoners are being shifted to other training. So even though that is dubious, continues to be internment, there continues to be reports of forced labor. They're responding to this international attention. So I do think international attention works. One of the kind of toxic elements in the book I mentioned is that there isn't enough kind of honest and open discussions of how democracies can do better. This kind of ignoring and sidelining of people who are trying to warn about intimidation of Chinese immigrants, for example, is one example where Western governments haven't been doing what it could do, kind of the baselines. And also, I think what we see in the US with the violence, with the Capitol riots, trying to undermine their own democracies, that also gives the Beijing kind of propaganda machine so much material to work with to try to discredit the West, saying if this is what's happening, then what are you to criticize us? So I'd love to hear what Frans-Paul and Sjoerd also think about this.
Yes, maybe Sjoerd first and then Frans-Paul.
Yeah, I'm not in a position to really tell what to do, obviously, but I mean it's never either or, engagement or containment. What I think that for the Chinese government has been the case for a very long time. Everybody always came there with a bunch of companies to do great business. And on the other hand, then always had their list, and the Chinese had then their list prepared as well. And at the end of the day, you did business and that was it. What you do see, I think, now that there is a more vocal international community, or at least part of the international community, that is able to be acting in a more united way. And I think the Netherlands last week within the United Nations essentially put out a statement, but literally led by the Netherlands with, I think it was about 40 or so different countries. 37? 47. Wow. Waiting for the Chinese response and see if they could gather more countries for a counter statement. They have already been on a holiday for the last week, but not with a number of countries, right? Okay. Anyhow, but you do see that there is sensitivity to some extent on the Chinese side, how things look to the outside world. I don't think it's number one, but there is a sensitivity, and particularly when it comes to also individual cases, the wives of human rights lawyers or the human rights lawyers, individual activists, that if there is attention, that it does seem that things improve. So obviously your question is much more about containment or how to deal with it, but I think that's much more in Frans-Paul van Putten's area.
Well, Fred, about your question, I will try to say just very quickly something. First, I think we have seen how China itself moved in the 1970s from very little engagement to more engagement with the West. And of course, that's a different situation, and China is not the West, but I think we can learn perhaps by looking at the underlying principles that maybe that China used at the time. And another thing is that relates to the book by Joanna. I think for us to engage with China, we also have to engage with our own colonial history, because this is something that we haven't had time yet to actually discuss. But it's also a very interesting part of the book where Joanna notes or points at the relevance of European and Western colonial history for today's relationship that we have with China. And I think that's also a second focus point for us to look at.
Yes. Any other questions from the audience here? I think we have time for 2 more questions. Not from here? Yeah.
My name is China. I used to work for the Dutch government in China before, previously, not anymore. So what I'm asking is on my own behalf. I'm always surprised, or I'm relatively surprised that the Netherlands is still in a relatively good book, seems to be, at least with China. I think we fulfill many of the conditions to be in the same position as Canada or Sweden or even the Czech Republic or one of those, and we're not. Even Sjoerd gets his visa extended for 12 months. I wonder if there's an explanation for that.
I mean, I'm also surprised in a way, because obviously in early 2020, under Trump, with the media fight with China, so to say, after which more than a dozen of our colleagues were kicked out of the country. Soon after that, the Australians got their portion, so to say, after the Australian government asked for an investigation in the origins of COVID. Chung Lei, CGTN employee anchor, was arrested. Two other correspondents, Australians working for Australian media, were called in by state security. Back then it was like, okay, is this getting closer to us as well? Also coming from a small country like the Netherlands, that is not always, but oftentimes relatively vocal. And it hasn't happened. So there were a few moments where I felt like, when are we going to be next? Is there a possibility that we as the Netherlands will get at some point in a position where we will get repercussions or get punished for whatever the government might have done? I think ASML export license was one of the moments where I felt like, not sure where this is heading to. The motion in Parliament adopted about an Uyghur genocide was also a moment where I felt like, let's see how Beijing is going to respond to this. But so far, I mean, I've also been trying to get a sense if any of our countries got punished for that. And then at some point there was one Shanghai. This was a year and a bit or something ago, but then it's the paperwork not in order, and it seemed just like the normal hassle you sometimes have importing, exporting. So no, I think for me the only one of the few explanations, let me put it like that, technology I think plays a role. There is still large demand, I think, for technology originating or linked to the Netherlands, the semiconductors. I do think that when it comes to Canada, I mean, we are part of the European Union. Canada, this all happened when the US was not the most reliable ally, so to say. It's the same with Sweden, Norway, Sweden to obviously also part of the Union, with Norway and the salmon. That was also an easy catch to stay in fishing terms. Lithuania, a very small one, but part also of the European Union. I think the Netherlands still in China, and I don't know what the exact reason is, but technology and still a strong engine politically also within the European Union. That's the only explanation I could have why, for now at least, because I mean, who knows what's happening tomorrow. The Netherlands has been able to be a little vocal, to stand out sometimes, but not get the same treatment as the Michaels, so to say, which obviously has been terrible. But who knows what happens if the next Munwanzhou lands at Schiphol and Washington calls, we wonder. Then I don't think it will necessarily be a good thing for Dutchies in China or Dutch companies in China either.
All right, we have time for one final question. Is there anyone who would like to ask their question here in the room?
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Jordi Klein, working at the Ministry of Defense. A question about your subtitle. You talked about, Joanna, about like a disorder, but is that only like a temporary moment, Because are we not proceeding to a maybe I would argue a new world order where power play is just much more important and much more in the open than it was some years ago? Because I think that's also the explanation why the Netherlands at the moment is maybe not like on the high point of like coercion from China, but because just of basic and very cold calculations from the Chinese side, why they don't like punish, at least in public, the Netherlands. So my question is this order a temporary thing going to a new world order? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think to me and others, I think in the past, you think about the political environment in China as becoming more repressive and becoming less, and it kind of comes in waves. Around the world, I think a lot of academics included hope that these kind of like rise and lowering of tensions and crackdowns would eventually, go downwards. But I think a turning point was when Xi Jinping basically appointed himself emperor for life. And that provides a more stable look into the future of how the Chinese government will operate. And under Xi, it has only become more and more centralized power around himself and more crackdowns on Chinese society. The trend is really clear that it's just more and more repressive. And as China feels maybe more insecure with its economic slowdown or with increasing criticism from the world, that its response has always been to, like Sjoerd said, to crack down harder, to make things more and more restricted. So we see that continuing, and I don't see this as temporary. With things like Huawei, with what the whole Meng Wanzhou issue touched off, with many countries having to decide whether to allow Huawei into its 5G networks. We see almost like a cleaving of the world where some countries have decided to, in a way, support Beijing by continuing to use Huawei, continuing to work with Chinese companies and the government, while others are kind of drawing a line and saying, we're not. So there is kind of almost this bipolar world forming. What gives me a bit more optimism is that Chinese papers themselves say they don't want a new world order that's completely different from the existing world order. What China is doing is they're trying to gain influence, gain seats, gain more prominence in organizations like the WHO and the United Nations. And that's concerning in a way because you worry about this influence. In Greece, I talked about how after Chinese state-owned company took over its port of Piraeus, Greece, Athens, 2 times at the UN vetoed or blocked EU criticisms of China's human rights situation. But what China is doing is not trying to dismantle the existing world order, but trying to gain more influence within it. And what the case studies in my book try to provide is that there's just different perspectives on this. Even in Europe, there are people who in a way support what China is doing because it is unhappy about American dominance and American hegemony. And they think it's healthy for Beijing to emerge as a rival superpower. So the reality seems very complex. And I think one good takeaway is that middle power countries like Canada, Netherlands, play a really big role in trying to shape what's to come, whether it is more and more unstable, potentially dangerous, or whether there could be policies and diplomatic engagement that is at least as best informed as possible. Looking at where the resources are for China studies, a lot of the best universities I found are in countries like the Netherlands and Canada, who can contribute a lot to this level of understanding that's often missing, especially among top level politicians who have to deal with these issues unfolding.
Thank you, Joanna, also for your final takeaway. And unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions. So I'd like to thank Sjoerd and Daas and Joanna Chiu for joining us today, to the audience for being here and joining online on Zoom, and to the publisher Lemniscate as well, Jean-Christophe and Jochem, who helped us organize this session. And of course, the colleagues at Clingendael for helping with the organization. For those interested in the book, as we've mentioned, you can buy it in the bookstores, the Dutch or the English version. For now, this was the last edition of the Clingendael Leest event series, or the Clingendael Reads event series, before the summer holidays. We've scheduled the next edition on September 8th, which will be at the Nutshuis. Our director, Monica C., will be in conversation with Professor Mark Elgadis, where they will discuss his book, Reset, Identiteit, Gemeenschap en Democratie. But for now, thank you to those joining us online. And for those here in person, I hope you will join us for a drink. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you so much. Wish I could be there in person.